You know, history is full of amazing comeback stories, but this one is on another level. We're talking about India's second urbanization. After its first incredible cities just disappeared, India went through a thousand-year quiet spell. This is the story of how cities came roaring back.
But to really get a handle on this rebirth, you gotta start with the collapse. We're talking about the Indus Valley Civilization here, one of the world's first great urban cultures. These people built these unbelievable, sophisticated cities that were thriving for centuries. And then, poof, they were just gone.
1,000 years. Seriously, just let that sink in for a moment. For nearly a whole millennium, after those cities fell, it's like urban life in India just went silent. It's a huge, almost unimaginable gap in the historical record.
So for that entire time, people basically went back to basics, living in small villages, a much simpler rural life. It's almost like that whole grand experiment of building big, bustling cities had been totally wiped from memory.
Which, of course, brings us to the big question. What was the spark? What happened that brought cities roaring back to life and literally reshaped the entire subcontinent forever?
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at that world without cities, what was lost. Then, we'll get into the great reurbanization itself. We'll check out the different kinds of governments that popped up, kingdoms versus republics. We'll dig into the awesome new technologies that made it all possible. And finally, we'll see the new social blueprint they created to organize it all. All right, let's start at the beginning. To really feel the impact of this comeback, you have to understand just how much was gone, just how much society had lost when those first amazing cities vanished.
And listen, we're not just talking about crumbling buildings. I mean, imagine losing everything that makes a city a city. The crowded streets, the busy markets, gone. The awesome sanitation systems, gone. They even lost their entire system of writing. A whole way of life was just erased. It was a complete societal reset. And then, after all that silence, around the first millennium BCE, something started to happen. A new chapter was beginning. But what's really interesting is that it didn't happen where the old cities were. A whole new center of gravity was forming, right in the super fertile plains of the Ganga River.
The first building blocks of this new world were these things called Janapadas, and the name is actually pretty cool. It tells you exactly what they were. Jana means people or a clan, and pada means foot. So a Janapada is literally a foothold, a place where a group of people put their feet down and settled, usually with a ruler called a Raja. Now, as you can imagine, these little footholds didn't stay little for long. Through a mix of trading with each other and, well, fighting with each other, they started to combine. They grew into these bigger, much more powerful states, which were called, you guessed it, the Mahajanapadas, the Great Realms. So, you gotta ask, why here? Why the Gangetic Plains? Well, the map tells the whole story. This area was just an absolute agricultural jackpot. The soil was so rich you could grow way more food than people needed. And that surplus, that's the key. It frees people up to do other things, become artisans or soldiers or builders. It's what lets you build towns, cities, and eventually entire kingdoms.
And this is the result. This is the new political map of India that took shape. You can see these 16 major Mahajanapadas, all packed into that fertile heartland. And you can bet they were all competing with each other for land, for trade, and for power.
And this isn't just some story from an old text. We can still see the evidence on the ground today. What you're looking at are the actual ruins of Rajagriha. This was the mighty capital of Magadha, which was one of the real heavyweights among these new states. It's just amazing to think these ancient power centers are still part of the landscape of modern India. So, how were these new states actually run? Now, the obvious assumption is, they all had kings, right? But the reality was way more complex and frankly a lot cooler. Check this out. You had two totally different systems of government flourishing at the exact same time. On one hand, you had your classic monarchies, think Magadha, where a king inherited the throne and had the final say. But then, you also had actual real-deal republics called Ganas or Sanghas. In these places, a whole assembly of people held the power. They made the big decisions together, and they even chose their own ruler. How wild is that for the ancient world? Right, so this explosion of cities and new kinds of government didn't just happen in a bubble. It needed fuel, and that fuel came from a massive revolution in technology and economics. These were the tools that literally built this new age. If the first urban civilization was built on bronze, this second one was forged in iron. People mastered how to work with this new metal,
which was way stronger and easier to find, and it completely changed the game. It was a revolution from the ground up, literally.
I mean, iron was a total game changer. With iron axes and plows, you could clear dense forests and farm on a scale they'd never seen before, which meant more food for those growing cities. And in warfare? Oh man, iron swords, spears, and arrows were lighter, sharper, and way deadlier than anything made of bronze. The armies with iron had a massive advantage.
Okay, so you've got all this extra food, all these new goods being made, and trade is just booming. This creates a new problem. Just trading stuff for other stuff, bartering, gets really clumsy really fast. You need a better, more efficient tool to keep commerce moving.
And the solution was coinage. These were the very first coins in India. Pretty simple, really, just little pieces of silver with different symbols punched into them. But this was revolutionary. Suddenly, you have a standard thing that everyone agrees has value. It was like pouring gasoline on the fire of trade, connecting the economies of all these different states like never before. So you have these bustling new cities, all these different jobs, new forms of government, new technology. The big question is, how do you organize all these people? You need some kind of social blueprint to make sense of this new, complex world.
And the blueprint that emerged is what we now call the Varna Jati system. Think of it as a two-layered framework. On the ground level, you had the Jati. This was your community based on what you did for a living. So all the blacksmiths might be one Jati, the potters another, and so on. Then you have the Varna, which were four big, broad categories from ancient texts, meant to organize all of society.
So here are those four big Varna categories. You've got the Brahmins, who are the priests and scholars, the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers, the Vaishyas, who are the merchants and farmers, the wealth creators, and the Shudras, the artisans and laborers. Now, it's really important to remember that while this system would become very rigid later on, back in this early period, it was probably a lot more flexible, a way to bring some structure to a society that was changing and diversifying at an incredible speed.
So in the end, when you step back and look at the big picture, this era did so much more than just put cities back on the map. It created a whole new blueprint for a civilization. We're talking about pioneering ideas in republican government, harnessing game-changing technologies, and creating a social structure that would endure for millennia. Which really makes you think, right? How do the echoes of these ancient innovations in politics, technology, and society still resonate with us today?